midwife and herb-woman, but they had been discredited and driven out, and the community as a whole was lost without this information. I mean, you know, it's like having all your hospitals, all your universities, everything taken away at a stroke. And so he came from a community where there was no written information. There was no source of information. It was non-verbal. Sorry, it was verbal only. And he was far enough into the book revolution, into the printing revolution, to be able to think that writing a book with all these remedies in was the most fantastic new idea. And I think that it hit him very early on. But he had one other asset which his Catholic background gave him. He spoke Latin, which means that when he came down to London to be an apothecary, he was able to talk to every single European scholar who came to the city. And he was able to read all the books that were published that were of any value, because they were all in Latin. And unlikely though it might seem, he became very close friends with this man. And this man is Matthias de Lobel, and he was of a far higher social status than John Parkinson. He was 30 years older than him, for a start, and he was in London because he had been physician to William of Orange, who was unfortunately assassinated, and that kind of made him redundant. So he had published two very highly rated scholarly books, one in 1571, and he would have met John before 1601 when this was republished. And the thing about these books, they were in Latin. What they did was they castigated other European scholars for not observing reality, for not looking at how things really were. And here, this engraving of him was done just before he died, so he might not have looked quite as severe as that all his life, but I think actually he was a very severe and forbidding character. And that was done in 1616, and underneath there's a quote from the poet Julian, which says, better to drink from the stream at source than to plunge in muddy brooks. So this was the key Renaissance idea. You go back to the beginning, you look and see how things really are. And he was a major influence on John, who met him when he was just, you know, an apprentice, 17. And they became very, very close, and John worked with him, and he was the reason that John became eventually to the king's attention, and he wrote very glowingly about John's honesty, and you know, he called him the most honest, reliable, and the best apothecary in the whole of London. What kind of a write-up could you get better than that? But there was something in, I think, the makeup of being a Catholic, where you were in an atmosphere which got increasingly frenzied of the distinction between truth and superstition. And a lot of the people who were burned as witches were prosecuted because they were on the wrong side of the religious divide. There was this fissure between Protestant and Catholic went all the way through the country and became a really bitter debate within families. And there are lots of instances which are in my book. You know, people who found that they were about to be hanged as a witch because somebody else was being taught by a Protestant and they wanted to join, you know, and they were still Catholic. So John was very suspicious of anything that smacked of superstition. And there was, in a tradition that was growing up with this Renaissance rediscovery of plants in Europe, of the teaching garden, the traditional garden. And this is one of the early ones in Leiden in Holland. And it's interesting that, you know, that they were looking to the Romans, they were looking back to the Romans, because Dioscorides, who had reached enormous proportions of almost ideological grandeur in the 17th century, so that anything he said was worth, you know, was good. He had been, as you probably know, he was a Greek, but he was a doctor to the Roman army in the 1st century AD. So he tried out all his remedies on Roman centurions, which is quite interesting. And then by hangs a tale. But anyway, he said, if there's anybody who wants to be a herbalist, to put things in the ground, be there when they come up and watch them flower, so that you really understand the plants you're using. And that's what these gardens are all about. And that's why John developed his own garden in Covent Garden, which he would have started growing about 1600. And it became a magnet, eventually, for all these people who were actually, the gardening became enormously fashionable. And so it wasn't just that they came to learn about, you know, what plants looked like for medicinal reasons when they grew up. They came for decorative plants, which John and Matthias Lobel shared a passion for. So he had a shop. He was an apothecary. I mean, he had a shop for most of his career. And this is an old map of St Paul's. It didn't have that spire when he had the shop. It was blown off in 1562 or something. But there's a lightning strike. But up here, on the other side of this little inlet, is Ludgate, and he would have had his shop there. So it was a fairly short walk to his garden in Covent Garden. And this is what Covent Garden looked like about that same date. You can see here, where the trees are, it was a garden. And that's the Strand, going along down to Charing Cross, and Whitehall Palace here. But it was nothing. It was a 7-acre garden, which was called Covent Garden because it had been the convent garden, and Henry VIII had taken it away from the nuns and given it to his friend the Duke of Bedford. Nice. Nice for some people. And so John Parkinson was able to rent 2 acres of this and develop out of the clay field a garden which became very, very famous.